The dust of the frontier road still hung in the air when they dragged old Elias Crowfoot out of his ranch house like a sack of broken bones, the sun burning low and cruel behind the mesas as his young son, Daniel, screamed for them to stop, his small hands clutching at his father's torn coat while the men laughed. 6 of them, drunk on cruelty and the belief that age had turned Elias into something harmless, something easy to break, and the first blow came before any words were spoken. A rifle butt crashing into Elias's ribs so hard the breath left him in a soundless gasp, his knees buckling but his eyes never leaving his son's face, because even as blood filled his mouth he wanted Daniel to see strength, not fear. But the men didn't care about lessons or dignity. They wanted land, they wanted cattle, they wanted to make an example of an old rancher who refused to sell, and so they beat him in the open yard where he had once taught his boy to ride and shoot and pray, boots thudding into flesh, fists cracking against bone, while Daniel cried and begged and tried to stand between them until one of the men backhanded him into the dirt, warning him that this was what happened to sons of stubborn men. And Elias felt something worse than pain then, something that tore deeper than broken ribs. Because a father can endure suffering but not the sight of his child, learning the world is cruel. And when they finally left him, bleeding in the dust with a warning that next time they'd burn the ranch to the ground, the men rode away laughing, not knowing that they had just awakened a debt older than their hatred, because Elias Crowfoot was not just an old rancher. He was a man who once saved lives in the high desert when nobody else would, a man whose scars came not only from cattle and weather, but from battles fought, shoulder to shoulder with Apache warriors who had called him brother of the long silence. And as night fell and Daniel tried to drag his father inside, Elias whispered words through cracked lips that sounded like prayers, but were really names, places, memories buried deep. And when dawn came, Elias did not go to the doctor or the sheriff, because he knew the law would come too late or not at all. So instead he saddled his horse with shaking hands, kissed his son's forehead, and rode east into lands most white men feared to enter, guided not by maps but by promises made decades ago under stars and firelight, traveling for days through heat and hunger until he reached a canyon where time seemed to wait, and there he stood and called out in the old tongue he had never forgotten, a call that echoed like thunder through stone, and from the shadows they emerged one by one, silent, watchful, proud, warriors whose eyes measured truth faster than lies. And when Elias told them what had been done, not with anger, not with revenge, but with the quiet voice of a father asking justice, the canyon filled with stillness, until an elder stepped forward and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, saying the world had grown arrogant again, forgetting that strength is not owned by the young or the cruel, and that debts of honor do not rot with time. And by sunset fires burned across the canyon as messengers rode out in all directions. And by the next dawn 400 Apache warriors stood ready, not for slaughter but for reckoning. Because when men beat an old rancher in front of his son, they did not just strike flesh. They struck a bond that would answer them with thunder. And as Elias mounted his horse at the head of that silent army, his body broken but his spirit unbowed, he knew his son would never again believe his father was weak. And if this story already has your heart racing and your soul leaning forward, remember to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this of justice, honor, and unforgettable reckoning are only just beginning. They rode at first light, 400 Apache warriors moving like a living shadow across the desert. No war cries, no banners, only the sound of leather, breath, and destiny. And Elias Crowfoot felt every ache in his battered body as if the earth itself were reminding him of the cost already paid, yet pain meant nothing now. Because beside him rode men who understood loss without explanation, men who had buried sons and fathers beneath the same unforgiving sky. And as they traveled, Elias remembered the younger version of himself, who had once stumbled into Apache territory wounded and hunted, saved not because he was white or weak, but because he showed respect, because he listened, because he chose honor over fear, and that choice now thundered behind him in the form of warriors armed, not just with rifles and blades, but with memory. And when they reached the ridge, overlooking the valley, where the men who beat him had gathered confident, careless, drunk again on stolen cattle and false power, the Apaches stopped as one, watching, measuring, until the elder lifted his hand, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath. And what followed was not a massacre, but a lesson written in iron discipline. Riders surrounding the valley without a sound, cutting off escape. Fires lit at the edges so smoke crept inward like judgment, and only then did the Apaches announce themselves. Not with screams, but with drums that echoed against the canyon walls, a heartbeat too large to ignore. And panic spread among the men below as they realized the stories they laughed at were standing alive and armed around them. And when one tried to run, he was disarmed and dragged back without bloodshed. Because this was not about rage. It was about truth, and Elias rode forward then, his presence causing whispers to ripple through the crowd as the men recognized the old rancher they thought broken, now standing upright with warriors behind him, his voice hoarse but steady as he spoke of what they had done, of the boy they struck, of the lie that strength comes from cruelty. And when one of the men spat and reached for his gun, an Apache warrior moved faster than thought, blade at the man's throat, stopping inches from death, proving that mercy, not weakness, was the choice being offered. And the elder declared judgment not in English but in the old tongue, translated slowly so every word could sink in, stating that these men would return the stolen cattle, rebuild the ranch they threatened, and leave the valley forever. Watched until they were gone, and any who broke that promise would answer not to lawmen but to memory. And one by one the men dropped their weapons, some crying, some shaking, because fear had finally found the right direction. And as the Apaches withdrew like mist under the rising sun, Elias felt something he had not felt since before the beating, peace, not because revenge was taken, but because his son would grow up knowing justice can be strong without being cruel. And when Elias returned home days later to Daniel running into his arms, the boy's eyes wide not with fear but pride, the old rancher knew the real victory was already won. And if this chapter gripped you, stirred your sense of justice, and made you feel the weight of legacy, subscribe to the channel, because stories that remind us what true strength looks like are far from over. The valley did not forget what happened, even after the hoofprints faded and the smoke cleared, because stories have a way of settling into the land like seeds, and months later travelers still spoke in hushed tones about the day 400. Apache warriors rose without rage and left without blood, and Elias Crowfoot grew older in those months, his wounds healing slowly, his hair turning whiter under the sun, but his presence somehow stronger, because Daniel walked beside him now with a straighter back, no longer startled by every raised voice, understanding that power does not always shout. And when the men who once ruled the valley with fear never returned, their names spoken only as warnings, the ranch became a place of quiet respect where neighbors helped neighbors and children learned that courage is not measured by fists. And sometimes at night Daniel would ask his father if he had been afraid that day. And Elias would look at the stars and tell him that fear never leaves a man. It only decides who it serves. And that day it served a promise to never let his son believe cruelty was the same as strength. And far away in the desert, the Apache warriors carried the story too, not as a tale of war but of honor repaid, elders telling young riders that alliances built on respect outlive guns and borders. And years later, when Elias finally lay beneath the same sky he had ridden under in pain and purpose, Daniel buried him with a simple marker and a feather, left by visitors who never spoke their names. And the boy, now a man, raised his own children on that land, teaching them the same lesson, that the world will test you sometimes brutally, but how you answer defines everything. And if this story stayed with you, moved you, or reminded you why honor still matters, subscribe to the channel, because stories like this, stories that live longer than the men who tell them, deserve to be passed on. Years passed like slow-moving clouds over the valley, and the ranch stood unchanged in spirit though weathered by time, its fences repaired, its fields alive, its silence no longer lonely, because Daniel Crowfoot had grown into the kind of man his father hoped the world would not break, a man who remembered the day fear tried to define him and failed. And whenever strangers asked why the land was never threatened again, Daniel would simply say that some debts are guarded by memory, not guns, and sometimes Apache riders would pass at a distance, never stopping, never waving, yet always watching. And Daniel understood that protection does not always announce itself. And when his own children asked about the scars on his father's old saddle, he told them the truth, not of hatred but of honor, of a day when cruelty believed it had won and learned it had awakened something far greater. And on quiet evenings, Daniel would sit on the porch where his father once bled in the dust and feel no anger, only gratitude. Because Elias, Crowfoot had shown him that a man's greatest strength is not how hard he strikes back, but how wisely he chooses his allies. And when Daniel finally placed a second marker beside his father's grave, years later, marked only with dates and the words "he kept his promise," the wind carried a low rhythm through the valley that sounded almost like distant drums, and the land rested again, knowing the story was complete, knowing justice had been answered without hatred. And if this final chapter left you thinking about legacy, courage, and what true strength really looks like, subscribe to the channel, because stories like this are not just meant to be heard, they are meant to be remembered.